Hello and welcome to MadEmmyify True Crime. If you've joined me from my other channel, it's so strange to not be whispering at you. Though if you've just found me looking for true crime on YouTube, hi! It's great to have you here. So on this channel, I will be covering any true crimes that I've done as ASMR true crimes. So I suppose that'll mean a lot more to you if you've come from my other channel. Basically, for the past half a year, I've done whispered true crime, and I thought that I would create this second channel as a place to do the same true crimes at a normal speaking volume, because there's some people who, even though they like ASMR, they might not like ASMR true crime, or you might like true crime but be like, I don't want to listen to someone whisper about a case. A lot of the cases I cover are British crime, though I do occasionally do an American true crime every once in a while. And they tend to be the more historic crimes actually lately. And when I say historic crimes, I mean like witch trials. Today's a witch trial. And like murders from the 18th century. I've done a few of those, but I do also do like Victorian crimes and more modern crimes, ranging, well, I did the Twitter killer on my channel last week. I will be recording all of the ones that I have done as ASMR because I still have all of my scripts for those. So they will all be coming soon. I might just do them, like, for a while I'll probably do twice weekly videos until I'm kind of caught up, and then it'll just be the videos that I've done as ASMR, done normal speaking. Anyway, I'm aware that this intro is getting a little bit rambly and you're probably like, just get on with the case. I will put a timestamp to tell you when I get on with things. Anyway, as I mentioned before, today I'm talking to you about the North Berwick Witch Trials. I always have to have my notes, so I'm sorry if you don't like that I'm not looking at the camera during this. I can't memorise it all. I'm sorry. I've literally just finished, I'm saying the word literally too much. I've just finished recording this in ASMR form, and straight away I'm recording this in normal speaking form. So hopefully it's a bit more fresh in my mind. Hopefully I don't botch the pronunciations of some of the names, and hopefully I get this finished quickly so that I can catch Call Me Kevin's GTA 5 Chaos Mod stream. Anyway, let's get into the North Berwick Witch Trial. The North Berwick Witch Trials took place in the Lothian area of Edinburgh between 1590 and 1593. The first associated arrest was in December 1590, but the exact number that were detained is unknown. None of the convicted were actually from North Berwick. The name came from the largest alleged gathering of witches that had occurred on Halloween 1590 at the kirkyard in North Berwick. It's referred to a couple times as the Witches' Convention throughout this. The trials were heavily political and became rooted in the popular culture of the day. The three witches in Shakespeare's play Macbeth are heavily influenced by the incident. I'm going to be going into a bit of background as to why King James was very anti-witch. In other witch trials I've covered on my ASMR channel, I've mentioned King James and that a lot of witch persecution happened during his reign. But this goes a little or a lot more into the background with the North Berwick witches. Anyway, James the First of Scotland was also King James the Sixth to rule Scotland, though at the time of these trials he was only the king in Scotland. In the 16th century, there was still a strong belief in witchcraft among peasants and nobility alike. Scotland was going through a religious upheaval, with Protestants trying to recast a lot of beliefs as superstition or witchcraft in an attempt to get rid of these beliefs and move towards a social and moral rehabilitation. From 1586, in fact, supporters of extreme Presbyterianism had returned to Scotland. King James's reign in Scotland was also beset by political turbulence that was exacerbated by a famine and the plague. King James's first cousin was Francis Stuart, who was the 5th Earl of Bothwell. From now on, I pretty much just refer to him as the Earl of Bothwell. He was well educated, from a noted Protestant family, and had strong political ambitions. King James had even named him as an heir in 1576. King James's fascination with persecuting witches began in 1589. An agreement had been made that James would marry 14-year-old Princess Anne of Denmark. The marriage was seen as politically advantageous, as Denmark already traded with Scotland and was a Protestant country. A proxy marriage took place on August 20th, 1589 in Copenhagen, and at the start of September, Anne attempted to sail to Scotland to join her new husband. Unfortunately, the voyage was marred with storms and leaking ships, so the flotilla was forced to take refuge in Norway. They tried again later in the month, twice in fact, but again storms and leaks meant that the voyage was abandoned. Scotland also saw bad storms that autumn. A ferry boat transporting wedding presents for the king sank in a storm while crossing the Forth. All presents were lost and 40 people died, including Janet Kennedy, who was a courtier that King James had personally picked to be a lady-in-waiting for his new wife. Despite the bad weather, James decided that a fleet should be sent from Scotland to Denmark to bring Anne to him. Initially, the Earl of Bothwell was to make the voyage, but the Chancellor, Lord Maitland, advised James that he should go instead. King James ignored advice about the inclement weather and set off on October the 21st and left Bothwell to govern in his absence. This time the voyage was a success and he met Anne in Oslo, where the two were officially married. The couple returned to Denmark and stayed there until early 1590. Then, on April the 21st, they set off back to Scotland. Again, the voyages were plagued by storms and rough seas. The voyage should have taken 3 days, but it took 11 days and they didn't dock in Leith until May the 1st. While James had been in Denmark, several Danish women were rumoured to have conjured storms using witchcraft. The allegations started after Peter Monk, the admiral who'd been in charge of the aborted voyages made by Princess Anne, made accusations against Christopher Valkendorf, the governor of Copenhagen. The two did have a long-standing feud, and it was the job of Valkendorf to control the finances for the maintenance of the Danish Royal Navy. Monk claimed that the ships had been in a poor state of repair, meaning that they had been unable to cope with these storms. Valkendorf's counter for the accusation was that the storms were the result of witchcraft, so how could the ships have been expected to cope? This wasn't a normal storm, this was witchcraft. Apparently this was pretty common in a common scenario in Scandinavian countries, and turbulent seas were often blamed on curses made by witches. After being tortured, a local woman named Anne Coldings confessed that she had used witchcraft to make the storms. She was already imprisoned at the time as a suspected witch. Colding described how a group of women had gathered at the house of Karen the Weaver to make the spell. She named 5 of her accomplices, including the wife of the mayor of Copenhagen. The trials began in April 1590, and about 13 people, including the mayor's wife, were executed, while another killed herself in prison. Anne Colding was considered a bit of a celebrity witch, and she was known as the Devil's Mother because she was such an awful witch. That was like a reputation that she upheld throughout her incarceration. After the trial, there was a suggestion that the Denmark witches had been colluding with the Scottish witches, with one sailing from Denmark to Scotland on a sieve. I guess maybe her broom was being repaired. But these rumours didn't reach Scotland until late July. After returning to Scotland, James was busy with organising Anne's coronation and entertaining his 223 Dutch guests. Trials and investigations into witchcraft were taking place in Scotland during this time, but the king was pretty busy. He showed little interest other than perhaps a slight intrigue, though in April 1589 he had met with Marion McClanrock, a woman from Aberdeen who had reportedly cured a man of an illness. He had also met with a woman from Lübeck in Germany who had arrived in Leith to see Queen Anne in July 1590. The woman even claimed to have a prophecy for the king about noble deeds he would perform. You can see the similarities with the witches in Macbeth there. As I mentioned earlier, while James VI was in Denmark, the Earl of Bothwell had governed in his absence, and this had gone very smoothly. But after the king's return, relations soured, and by the October, King James was becoming increasingly distrustful of the Earl. And now, onto the witch trials themselves. In November 1590, David Seaton, who was a magistrate at Tranent, became suspicious that Gellis Duncan, one of his servants, was involved in witchcraft, as she had suddenly gained a reputation as a healer and was frequently absent from her living quarters at night. Seaton and his son, who was also named David, were locally known as keen witch hunters. Gellis was tortured, and of course, during this torture she confessed. She then began implicating others. Those she accused included Agnes Sampson, an elderly midwife from Netherkeith, and Dr. Fyon, who was also known as John Cunningham, a schoolmaster from Preston Pass. As typically happens with these witch trials, a wave of accusations emerged. On the 11th of November, Richie Graham, who had a well-established and long-standing reputation among the aristocracy as both a magician and a necromancer, because, you know, the two go hand in hand, I guess, was detained in the Edinburgh toll booth. Initially, the individuals accused were all of a very low social standing. Again, that's usually what happens. Very quickly, however, members of high society began being accused. Barbara Napier, who was part of Edinburgh's high society, and Euphame McAlzian, a prominent heiress, were both accused, as they had prior involvements with Agnes and Gellis. King James had shown a passing interest in the early proceedings against Gellis and Agnes. James was informed that during her confession, Agnes had confessed that she had seen Gellis play a Jew's harp, which is like a little mouth organ, at a witches' convention in the North Berwick Kirk on Halloween 1590. After hearing this, the king insisted Gellis be brought before him to play the instrument. Agnes was also given an audience with the monarch. During this, she described her involvement in several deeds designed to cause harm to the king. He also interrogated Dr. Fyon. At some point as well. But the king didn't seem too worried, as this wasn't, in his eyes, some grand conspiracy of treason, and the justice system would deal with them. Fian was tried and found guilty of witchcraft on December the 26th, 1590. Agnes was tried and found guilty on the 27th of January, 1591. She was burned at the stake the very next day. At this point, about 40 people were in prison awaiting trial, and 8 had already been executed. During the April, Richie Graham made a statement claiming that the Earl of Bothwell was at the heart of plots to harm the king, and that he and the Earl of Bothwell had several meetings to plan overthrowing the king, and had sought help from other witches. He claimed after they had failed to sink the king's boat, they had attempted to poison the king, and when this had failed, they burnt a wax effigy of the king to try and cause his death. The Earl was imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle by the Privy Council on April the 15th, which was actually the same date that another of the accused witches, named Robert Greeson, died from the torture he received. As the official documents were drawn up and Bothwell was incriminated further, the king began to take matters a little more seriously. After the arrest of the Earl of Bothwell, the high society trials began, starting with Barbara Napier, who was a known acquaintance of the Earl. She was tried on May the 8th, 1591, and found guilty of consulting with witches, namely Richie Graham and Agnes Sampson, but found not guilty of the charge of being at the witches' convention. Initially, the jury were reluctant to give the death penalty, but they did eventually on May the 10th. King James didn't like the verdict and wrote to the jurors insisting a guilty verdict should be returned for all charges. They were all ordered to attend an audience with the king on June the 7th, where he berated them at length and emphasised the clear errors in their judgment. During this trial of the jurors, the allegation Barbara was involved in a plot to harm the king unfolded. This hadn't been mentioned at her initial trial. She did manage to gain a stay of execution by claiming she was pregnant, but after that point, her fate's unknown. As far as records are aware, she was still in prison in June 1591, and she may have been executed later that year alongside 5 others, but there aren't any official records, I think, directly of her execution. In the meantime, the charges of conspiracy to commit treason with the aid of Barbara Napier and other witches were put against the Earl of Bothwell. He, of course, denied these claims and threatened dire retribution against his accusers. The king's suspicion of the Earl, however, only intensified, but as Bothwell still had a lot of support amongst the nobility, the king knew any charges would be difficult to enforce. A close affiliate of the Earl, Euphame Macalzian, was imprisoned on May the 7th, 1591. She was interrogated about letters and food that she had sent to the others who were held in custody. Earlier that year, statements had actually already been taken from several people, including her own servants, and these statements claimed that Euphame had been present at witches' gatherings in Archerton Haven and North Berwick. Several of those who were on trial for witchcraft, including Gellis, claimed that at the witches' convention, Euphame had a waxen image of King James, and claimed that the Earl of Bothwell would be the next king. Because of her connections to Bothwell, Euphame was also looking at charges of treasonable witchcraft. Euphame's trial began on June the 9th, 1591. 6 eminent advocates argued her defence over several days, but on June the 12th, a jury of nobles found her guilty of 10 of the 28 charges against her. One of the charges she was found guilty of was being a well-known witch. She was also convicted on 2 counts of attending witches' meetings. Euphame was sentenced to death by burning at the stake, as well as having to forfeit her estates. Her execution was delayed as she claimed that she was pregnant. However, she was still executed on the 25th of June 1591, whilst still maintaining her innocence. Whilst Euphame's trial was taking place, two things happened. One, the king interviewed Janet Kennedy, who was known as the Witch of Reddin. She confirmed Richie Graham's accusations against the Earl of Bothwell, and a week later, 3 days before Euphame's execution, the Earl of Bothwell escaped captivity in the night through a hole cut in the roof of the room where he was being held captive. He had actually been informed a few hours earlier that the king was considering granting him bail on the condition that he be banished overseas. On the day of Euphame's execution, a royal proclamation was issued against the Earl of Bothwell, claiming his escape from custody was a sign that he was guilty, and he was declared an outlaw and a traitor who used witchcraft for political motives. At that point, it was also asserted that he may be a necromancer. Over the next 6 months, several of those who had accused Euphame retracted their initial statements, claiming David Seaton and his son, along with several others, had forced them to make a false confession. In light of this, King James reversed the forfeiture of Euphame's properties and estate with an act he passed in 1592. All the land was returned to her daughters, with the exception of the Clifton Hall estate that James had already gifted to Sir James Sandilands, so that stayed with him because he couldn't really take back the gift he'd given. After his escape, the Earl of Bothwell got up to some legendary escapades, becoming a sort of Robin Hood figure. He managed to gain entry to the king's bedroom several times. In 1953, the charges against Bothwell were actually overturned, but he was excommunicated and forced into exile in Europe. He did attempt to mount several attacks on England and Scotland, but none of these ever happened, and there were rumours that he had dabbled in necromancy, but ultimately Bothwell died destitute in Naples in 1612. I hope that you have enjoyed this, my first true crime. I hope I've educated and informed you. Good night, and don't have nightmares.